Oh, that must have been just the.
Okay, it says you were live. Oh, now it says you're live now. Hold on.
Okay.
I don't see anything though. It's just dark.
Okay. I've got the share screen up.
Okay, I'll give it a few seconds. See if it. Okay, now I see your present. I see your opening slide.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, I think it's up.
So people can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We got 6 people. 7.
Okay, great. All right. Thanks. Okay. Uh, I am Christopher Allen Gordon, Director of Library and Collections at the Missouri Historical Society. And I want to welcome you today to this talk on my book, Fire, Pestilence, and Death, St. Louis, 1849. It is a beautiful day outside. I appreciate everyone being here. Not that we are really supposed to go anywhere else today, but it is nice to have everyone here and to talk about history, the history of St. Louis. And I hope everyone's doing well. So, one of the first questions I usually get when I talk about my book is why I wrote this book. And there's actually several reasons. The first is the fact that I have worked for the Missouri Historical Society for 17 years. In my position, I am actually responsible for all the maintenance, preservation, care, and reference access to our incredible collections at the Missouri Historical Society. And I started off as a associate archivist in the archives, and over the course of my job and helping people out with their reference questions, uh, and going through these original diaries and letters and so forth, occasionally I would find these great letters about 1849. And one thing that struck me was how so incredibly emotional many of them were, how they described these incredible circumstances in detail, some of which were written decades after the event had actually happened. But it was obvious that what they had gone through in 1849 had really left a mark on their lives. And I was very fortunate over the course of my years of doing research on this topic that I was able to use these primary source documents, but also uh, the Missouri Republican newspaper, which we have the most complete set of Missouri Republicans uh, in the United States. And it covers, almost 365 days of the year. Um, and so I was able to trace these events from beginning to end, not just through these great personal resources, but also through the published newspapers and then some other accounts. Well, over time, I really felt like I got to know these people that were living through this experience. And it was important, uh, I think, for their stories to be told in their own voices. And so one of the reasons why I wrote this book was really as a memorial to them, to what they had gone through, what they had experienced. These were people that were living in extremely challenging times. Death was their constant companion. and what they were enduring is something that and I'll talk about this a little later, something that I can identify with more now. Uh, but certainly, they were going through circumstances on a daily basis, not just through epidemics and disasters, that were quite challenging at every step of the way. So I wrote this as a memorial to them, their triumphs, their successes, their sadness, their pain. Uh, I hope that their voices come through in this book. Uh, and so, uh, to get back to the main reason why I wrote it, is not just a memorial to them, but also to bring all these great stories together into one book. One of the other things I discovered during the course of my research was that there had been bits and pieces of the story told about the Great Fire, about the cholera, about what was happening in St. Louis in 1849, but they had never been brought together into one book. And so I wanted to tell all those stories in one place. So today, in talking about fire, pestilence, and death in St. Louis in 1849. What I really want to do is talk to you about what the city of St. Louis was like at that time, put it all in context. And so I hope you get the book. I hope you read it, and that you certainly enjoy it. Uh, but I want to, I want to spend today like giving you the background information on what the city was like in the 1840s. And there was no better place to start than this place, what you see on the screen. And I must apologize that when using these PowerPoint slides through these streaming platforms, sometimes there's a little lag in the PowerPoint. So if you don't see an image right away, I apologize. But anyway, this is St. Louis levee in the 1840s. And if you were a newcomer to the city, if you were a passenger on a steamboat, this would have been your first view of the city. And you see the steamboats landing on the levee there. And when we think about the levee today, and if you go down to the arch grounds, the riverfront there, you see that the levee is completely covered in cobblestones and it is paved. That really doesn't happen until the 1850s. Uh, so just right after the period that we're talking about, it's not finished until the 1850s, 1860s. Prior to that, there were big chunks of the levee that were still very primitive, very crude, like you see here. It was a dirty, dusty, and often muddy place, depending on the weather. And that's all and good, but you have to realize that there is constant traffic going across this levee. So, people, wagons, horses, uh, carts being pushed around, like you see on the image here. Uh, it's constantly being filled with ruts, or in the summertime, it would get extremely dusty under the pounding of all these feet, and the dust would blow everywhere. So it was not a very attractive and or healthy place to be, especially when you consider the amount of animal traffic that's going through here. So oxen, horse, mule. There are stories of herds of swine wandering around on the levee at this time. And they're, of course, all making their daily deposits on the levee as well. So this creates, especially when it rains, when the snow melt happens, this muddy, mucky mess that people are tracking all around. And that will certainly add to our story later on. The row of buildings that you see stretching there into the distance are the warehouses of the various shipping agents that were such an important aspect of St. Louis commerce in the uh, especially in the pre-Civil War years. That is where all those goods that were being brought in from the steamboats was being stored and or awaiting distribution. And these store houses would just fill up to capacity to the point that often they had to put the stuff out in the open air out on the levee in order to store it and wait for it to be distributed. The red brick building you see there is one of the most important buildings in town. It was the original city hall. That center portion, the three-story center portion there, was the city hall building. And what was surrounding it was the city market. So it shows just how important commerce and its location on the riverfront were to be able to, just the farmers come in, they sell their produce and so forth. They can sell it just right there on the levee. You're bringing all these people in and out. So city commerce and city government were essentially one in this building. This is a map of St. Louis in 1844, which it would, even though the city was growing by leaps and bounds at this time period, the map would have generally looked the same in 1849 as it did in 1844. And you can see the river there at the bottom of the screen. Most of what you see there is either what is the downtown St. Louis today, the Arch Grounds, but there are also some other features that you probably won't recognize. One is these islands that I just highlighted on your screen, Duncan's Island and Bloody Island in the Mississippi River. The Mississippi is full of sediment, and it creates these sandbar islands, almost, or it did before it was channelized. It created these sandbar islands all the time, and they would come in after a few years. They'd wash away, but a few of them were established enough that they were not only there for a while, but they actually caused some problems. The one island that you see there would be on the right is Bloody Island, which was very famous for the duels that were fought there, hence the name Bloody Island. It was the chosen dueling ground because um, it was an island that was neither recognized by the state of Illinois nor the state of Missouri. It was kind of like a no man's land. And the idea was is that, well, I can go out there and if I happen to shoot somebody or murder somebody, it's going to legally be complicated. And so there were a number of duels, some of which were very famous, like Thomas Hart Benton's duel was fought out there on Pettus Island or on Bloody Island. I'm sorry. Duncan's Island, the large island that you see there on the left, was actually about 200 acres or more and had trees living on it, and some people were living on it for a while. Um, Eventually, what would happen is the river would become channelized. They put in a series of levees and dikes to increase the force of the water and river to actually wash these islands away so they wouldn't further fill in with sediment and push the city back further from the water, which was the main concern of the city fathers at that time. So Duncan's Island eventually erodes away, and those sloughs that you see behind it, closer to the shore, will fill in. And so today, when you drive across the Poplar Street Bridge, you're driving over a portion of what would have originally been Duncan's Island. The other feature that is on this map that you no longer see is uh, Chateau's Pond. And Chateau's Pond was a man-made reservoir, man-made lake that was essentially in the area where Union Station is today. And it was quite large. It was created by damming up Mill Creek by the Chateau family, who had a grist mill, a mill down there in the colonial period. And it became very popular. It was a popular place for people to go and have picnics, to stroll around the lake, to paint. There are many, many artists that painted images of Chateau's Pond. But by 1849, you see a tremendous amount of houses and industry that begin to pop up along the edge of the reservoir of the pond. And they begin to use it as a sewage lagoon, essentially. And this will definitely be a major player in our story later on. The one thing that is happening in the 1840s and by 1849 is this huge population explosion that occurs in the city. So St. Louis is founded in 1764 as a French colonial trading post. And it remains this sleepy French village for many decades, actually. After the Louisiana Purchase, things begin to change a little bit. More Americans, primarily Kentuckians, Tennesseans, Virginians, some folks from the Carolinas, begin to stream into St. Louis and stream into Missouri to get a hold of all that available land. And so by the 1820s, it's bumped up a bit. We're now a frontier town that's in the thousands. Around 1830, there's about 8,600 people living in St. Louis, and certainly it's the largest urban center, city, whatever you want to call it, in the American West, on the edge of the frontier, on the edge of American settlement. And these Southerners that had moved into the region had become the major influence in the city. They were Southern, they were Protestant, they were many of them were slaveholders, and so it gave the city this very Southern feel. The French colonial folks had been more or less pushed out of the way by these overwhelming numbers of Southerners. Then in the 1830s, you see something new happens, and that is the influx of immigrants. And as soon as the immigrants from Germany, from Ireland, from England begin to come into the United States and come up the Mississippi, many of them are choosing St. Louis as a destination. And every 5 years, you see this almost complete doubling of the population. So 8,600 in 1830, 1835, there's over 16,000. 1840, there's over 30,000. By 1849, you have about 78,000 people living in the city of St. Louis. So in that 15-year period, you've seen this exponential growth, this huge population explosion. And it is primarily these immigrants coming into the city or people that are coming west from the east, although that percentage is not as high. Um, in 1849 alone, 20,000 Germans resettled in St. Louis. So to give you an idea of just how many people were just flooding in, it was something that the city itself could not handle. So it was straining every sense of municipal government, and there was no real city services, or very few city services. Um, Certainly no sanitation like trash pickup. Very few of the streets were paved. The sewer system was very primitive. The water system was very primitive. And all of this was, this huge population explosion was taxing all those services. And the city was struggling in many ways. But at the same time, there was also this influx of investment in the city because we were on the edge of civilization and we were the point where the Santa Fe Trail, met civilization, where the westward trails also had a jumping off point because people would come into the city via the steamboats. They would get their supplies, get their provisions, then they'd head out to Independence or Westport or St. Joe to begin many of the overland legs of their journeys. So St. Louis was benefiting from this inflow of people and investment from Eastern investors who are building industry and opening merchant shops and things like that. So, as you can see in this image that was actually taken about 1850, the levee was the heart of commerce in St. Louis. And these boats were just stacked side by side, which of course is going to have some implications later on in our story. But you can also see how all this, traffic on the levee, how busy it is. You can see the freight, the cargo packed up on the levee, and so there's this constant flow in and out, and really made St. Louis a bustling city. That had once been the sleepy frontier town, but now was becoming an urban center. And if you were someone who arrived in the city for the first time, you would have seen this transformation. The city must have looked very eclectic. If you were walking down the street in the 1840s, you might see someone like Kit Carson, the famous Western scout and explorer and fighter, who was, you know, in St. Louis periodically because of his work with the U.S. Army as a scout and also his involvement in the fur trade and uh, you know certainly all that was interconnected, and you would have seen frontiersmen like Kit Carson wandering around the streets. Or you might see somebody like Dan Rice. Uh, Dan Rice is someone that very few people know about today. There's actually a really good book about Dan Rice called The Most Famous Man You'd Never Heard of. Dan Rice was a comedian. He was a promoter, an organizer, business manager, entertainment manager. Everyone in the 1840s and 1850s would have known who Dan Rice was. He was an A-list celebrity in this time period. And he had his own circus. He had his own comedy troupe that would tour the United States, and they came to St. Louis quite often. Uh, to look at Dan Rice, again, very few people know who he is today, but if you look at him, you can tell that you can see some familiar features and understand why. Uh, he was actually one of the first models for the figure of Uncle Sam. And Dan Rice was apparently an extremely patriotic man. He was an extremely patriotic man, and he loved the fact that they used his image as Uncle Sam. Um, After the 1850s, he actually becomes, like many, sadly, many celebrities, he is kind of pushed off into oblivion. He has a messy divorce. He has a lot of fights with other entertainers. All of this sounds very familiar. Some things never change. And then he actually dies penniless. But he was an extremely interesting man, and you certainly would have seen him in St. Louis. If you were in St. Louis in 1842, you might have seen Charles Dickens walking around. St. Louis was the furthest western city that Dickens visited on his U.S. tour in 1842. And he said some nice things about St. Louis, but probably his famous quote is that St. Louis is a nice city, but it'll never be Cincinnati. Apparently, he really enjoyed his time in Cincinnati and thought it was a little bit more cosmopolitan than St. Louis. But it is great that he visited here, and he actually wrote about his Western adventure. I believe it was in Martin Chuzzlewit, his story Martin Chuzzlewit, where he talks about coming to St. Louis and going to Cairo, Illinois, and being in the West and so forth. Another individual that you might have seen walking around the streets is Chief No Heart of Fear of the Iowa Indians. And St. Louis was the headquarters of the Indian Affairs Superintendent of the West. So these Native American troops would come to the city quite often and to negotiate treaties, to receive their gifts and support items from the federal government. So it is not unusual to read in the newspapers about all these visiting famous chiefs that came to St. Louis. One of the great aspects of this is that there was, as you can see in this image, there were great daguerreotypes of photographs taken of many of these individuals, and that's because there was a wonderful daguerreotypist in St. Louis at that time by the name of Thomas Easterly. And he was a professional portrait photographer and certainly did this as a career. But he also went the extra mile and pulled in many famous individuals or not so famous individuals that represented life in the American West and preserved their images for us. And we are so grateful for that. And they are now preserved in the Missouri Historical Society collections, and we have, I believe, over 600 of these images. And many of them are identified, some of them aren't, but they are literally great snapshots of this period of American history. So I mentioned the influx of immigrants. This caused a tremendous amount of tension in St. Louis. And that was because these new immigrants had customs and lifestyles that this old Southern Protestant guard found not only threatening but often offensive. Like I said, they were mostly Germans, they were mostly Irish, and they certainly had their own customs that they brought from the old world, from the old country. And two of the things that that bothered the nativist Southern Protestants the most was one, that they spoke their own languages and they consumed large amounts of beer and alcohol. Two things that offended the locals. But what offended them even more was the fact that these primarily German immigrants loved to indulge in beer drinking on Sundays, on the Sabbath. And they would go to these beer gardens like you see in the images here. They would talk politics, they would sing songs, they would generally have a good time on Sundays, uh, and when you were not supposed to. This was a transition, actually, point in American history in terms of the Sabbath. Um, that year, the Missouri Republican also offended a lot of locals because they began to publish a Sunday newspaper, which was completely unheard of. And so you had this cultural transition that is going on, as well as this, you know, these uh, various changes overall in the composition of the American population. These two images are not from 1849. Unfortunately, I don't have a beer garden image from 1849. The one that shows the bigger garden with the trees and so forth is probably from, or it is from the 1870s. Great image. The larger image there is actually from around the turn of the century. But the reason I love this image is because you see that little boy sitting in the center of the screen, and there's a sign above him. And when you look at the sign, it says, "Take a drink. Things will appear different." So it's a great image, and um, uh, it's very symbolic of what was going on in the city at that time. The other influx of people flowing through the city are the westward uh, bound pioneers and settlers that are passing through St. Louis. And this painting here that is in our collections was painted by a man named James Wilkins. And Wilkins, I think, perfectly captures this scene that had occurred so many times throughout the American Midwest, New England, even parts of the South, where people packed up everything they owned, or everything they could carry, I guess I should say, and really took a chance to head west into what was essentially the wilderness for the most part, and just to start a new life. And this was a huge leap of faith for them. They were leaving behind everything they knew, their place of birth, their jobs, but most importantly, their families. This was a time period where communications and transportation were still extremely primitive. And so there was a very good chance that those loved ones you left behind, your family, your friends, you would literally never see them again. Um, if not, you know, because of the distance, but, you know, many people had much shorter lifespans, obviously. And so there just was not a chance to see people later. Um, this image called "Leaving the Old Homestead," I think is a great example of what was happening in the country. Those people were streaming through St. Louis. They were all funneling through the city. Most of them would take the steamboats down the Ohio, or up or down the Mississippi, disembark in St. Louis. Sometimes they would stay a while to make some extra money before heading west, but often they would spend a couple of days and then jump on a steamboat and go up the Missouri to take it to Independence or St. Joseph or what have you before they went on the overland trails. But all this was greatly benefiting the city, as I said before. It was the merchants were becoming wealthy, and many would become extremely wealthy during this time period because they were outfitting and supplying all these westward bound travelers. Another group of folks that's coming through are the Gold Rush 49ers. So in January of 1848, uh, up in Sutter's Mill and near Sacramento in California, gold is discovered in his mill trace. And once word got back to the eastern portion of the United States, uh, everyone wanted to go out west and try their hand at panning for gold and digging for gold out in the gold fields in California. About 150,000 Americans, mostly young single men, but some family men too, took the chance and flooded out there to um, become miners. Uh, I it's amazing that by 1855, just to give you an idea how many people flooded in there, and not just Americans, they were coming in from all over the world, China, Chile, up from Mexico, all over. And California, which essentially had been a backwater and had maybe a few thousand people at that time in this particular region. By 1855, 1 in 90 Americans lived in California in just this short period of time. That gives you an idea just how many people were flooding in to try their hand at either getting gold themselves or to make a living selling to miners, merchants, and so forth. And again, like the westward bound travelers, these folks were flooding through St. Louis. Some of the most entertaining stories that you read in the newspaper at the time are talk about these groups of miners that are coming in from the East Coast, heading west. And these guys went all out. They would often it was like a Masonic lodge or a group of friends from church or maybe a bunch of factory workers that were tired of working in the factories and thought they'd get rich out in the gold fields. They would pool all their money together. They would outfit the trip, but they would go the extra mile and they'd do things like buying matching uniforms and hiring or outfitting a band and hiring a company physician or surgeon. These were almost like military expeditions they would put together, but certainly all privately funded. And there are these great accounts of how when the steamboats arrived in St. Louis, these guys would march off the boats and they would hold like a little parade down on the levee or through the city. And everyone thought that they were so charming and well organized. The hindsight of history, of course, is you find out what happens later. And these guys would get out on the Great Plains or out in the deserts, the far deserts, and those matching uniforms and bands and things didn't seem to matter or seem necessary as much anymore. Most of them were just happy to get to California alive because they were being decimated by disease and hurt in accidents and starving and so forth and so on. With all these people flooding into the city, not only was it creating infrastructure problems, but it was all also creating problems with increased crime. So when you have new people coming in, they're going to undoubtedly have folks that want to take advantage of the situation. And so the newspapers are just full of these incidents of violence, robberies, um, burglaries, murders that are happening almost on a daily basis in the city. And one of the things that compounds all of this is the fact that the city has no true organized police force. They only had something that was called the day guard and the night watch. And these were essentially not really volunteer, they were paid, but they were groups that were appointed by the mayor to act as a city police force. There was a city marshal, and these guys were kind of like his deputies. And when they were lucky enough to catch criminals, they took them down to the old city jail, the old calaboose, like you see here in the picture, over on Chestnut Street. And this place was uh, probably one of the worst places that you could be housed if you were a criminal. Um, it wasn't the most secure. There was many stories about how guys would just kick out the bars and the windows and escape. Sometimes they just simply ran past the guards. But those who didn't were not lucky enough to do that were locked in a pretty filthy, nasty place. And there's a story I talk about in the book about how this unfortunate guy who was arrested for drunkenness was taken to the jail and locked in a cell to dry out for the rest of the day. And he was pretty much forgotten about. And when they went back to check on him in the evening, at one point he had died sometime during the day. And when they found him, he was being half eaten by rats. So it just goes to show what the conditions were like in the jail. This was, of course, later ripped down, and a new city jail was built around the time of the Civil War. This is also a time period where you see a great deal of change in the African American population of the city. Not only free persons of color, but also the enslaved in St. Louis. And slavery in St. Louis was a little bit different than what you see in other parts of the slave states. There tended to be a lot of skilled labor in the city, as well as, of course, the folks that were working down on the levee as part of the riverfront trade. Uh, some of these individuals were certainly free persons of color. And you see this emergence of this black middle class out of this time period. And there were two jobs in particular that were extremely lucrative uh, for the African American population. One were dray drivers, that is, the guys that went down to the levee, loaded up the cargo, and distributed all over the city. And these guys flourished, and some of them became very successful. The other good occupation was to be a barber, like you see in the image here of Bob Wilkinson, who became very successful in the city and owned quite a bit of land. Wilkinson was lucky enough to get jobs at several of the hotels and act as the barber in the hotels. So when you have a city that's like St. Louis, that's a major transportation hub, there were a lot of what were considered first-rate hotels in the city. And he and several other African American men really benefited from working in these hotels, um, and would go on to be, their kids and grandkids and so forth would, like I said, be this very strong middle class element in the city. One thing that was quite eye-opening in doing the research on this was almost, well, literally every day in the St. Louis newspapers, you would see these runaway slave ads or these slave sales ads. And one thing you begin to realize is, first of all, um, the difficulty of these individuals' lives and how they had no control over their own lives, that they were at the whim of whoever owned them. Um, but you also start to realize that because they were essentially property, and there were very little details recorded about their lives other than they might be in a census as a number and nothing else, is that some of these are probably the only records that survive of these individuals. The runaway slave ad talks about a woman named Maria, a dark brown woman about 21 years of age, was raised in St. Charles, is about 5 feet 2, has been burned on the inside of both her hands. Her left hand is so much burned that she cannot open the last three fingers of the same. We don't know what happened to Maria. We can only hope that she did escape to freedom. Uh, and we certainly don't know her last name from this. But we see these other incredible details and that tell some sort of story about her life and her hardship and the fact that she was able to run away. The other ad is also very symptomatic of the time. It says, "Family of Negroes for sale. An excellent Negro woman, aged 23 years, and her two children, one aged 5 years, the other an infant. The woman is a first-rate cook and strictly honest. They are sold for no fault. In other words, there's nothing wrong with these individuals, but the owner being about to leave for California. So this slave family, this woman and her two children, could be potentially broken up, sold off, parsed out to another owner because her owner wanted to go out to the California gold fields. It just shows how precarious their lives were, that you had no real control over your own life. Another story from 1849 is the story of the fire companies of the city. There was not a municipal fire department in St. Louis until about 1858. So there were 10 private fire companies in the city that fought all the fires and protected the city. But these groups were, larger than life figures in the city. Many of them were Irish immigrants, Scottish immigrants. They were extremely proud of their position in the city, and they would hold parades. They kept their equipment in tip-top shape, shiny, painted, like you see in this Central Fire Company pumper that we have in our collection. This is an actual pumper from that time period. It would have been used to fight the Great Fire. Um, and you see, they had these great uniforms that they would wear, like you see in the photograph on parade. The fire hats, we have a great fire hat collection. This Fred Colburn I have a lot of his stories in my book. Um, and, these guys or it was part fraternal organization, part, you know, firefighting group, certainly. But they did a lot of boosterism for the city. They raised money. Um, when the cholera epidemic was raging, there were no nurses really in the city at that time. And it was the firefighters that were really the ones taking advantage of what was going on. The uh, taking advantage of going on in terms of nursing the sick. I shouldn't say taking advantage. They weren't taking advantage. They were stepping in to act as nurses and caregivers during this time period. They, like many, had a very dangerous life, and I like this image because it shows how dangerous it was to travel in this country on the river. This riverfront image shows all the various accidents that could occur um, if you were traveling on the river. Steamboats were um, extremely risky to travel on. They were steamboat technology was still pretty primitive, and it was not unusual for a boiler to just simply explode spontaneously and kill people, scorch people, certainly burn the boat up. The boats were cheaply made for the most part because they were cranking them out. The average life of a steamboat was about 18 months. Um, and uh, so they would often burn. They would get hit. They would snag in the river um, and sink, or they would just spontaneously catch on fire from burning embers that came from the boilers. The uh, warehouses uh, also would catch on fire. And so um, um, the firefighters would be called to these as well. Uh, the image that you see here I love because it's actually the letterhead of a insurance company. And so if you it's basically telling you this is what can happen to you if you don't take out insurance, or these are all the risks that you take in life, so you certainly should have insurance. And I love those dark, foreboding clouds that are in the background there, too. So, two of the most well-known events from 1849 are the Great Fire and the Cholera Epidemic, and I certainly talk about these in the book. The Great Fire uh, starts on May 17th, 1849. It is a warm night, and all those steamboats were lined up along the river, like you saw in that earlier photograph. And somehow the steamboat White Cloud catches on fire and is soon spreading flames to the adjacent boats. The boat that was right next to it was the Edward Bates, and it was unmoored with the hope that if you pushed it out into the channel, that it would simply float off and burn itself out. The problem is that it actually got caught in the current and began to spin around and crash into the other steamboats that were also moored on the levee until 23 steamboats and barges were completely engulfed in flames. Then during the evening, a northwest wind begins to, or northeast wind begins to blow, and it begins to blow the embers onto all that cargo and freight and those warehouses that are along the riverfront, and they begin to burn. Uh, Certainly, by this time, the fire companies were fighting the fire, but it was overwhelming. And at one point, even the water system in the city fails, the pressure fails. Some 1,000 men will fight the fire over the course of the night. The hero of the Great Fire is this individual, Thomas Targhee, who was the captain of the Missouri Fire Company. And he was an experienced firefighter. He knew that the only way you were going to stop a fire of this magnitude was to create a fire break, a firewall, and essentially starve it of its fuel, of its energy. The only way to do that in 1849 is to blow up buildings in the fire's path, and that's what they do. So he calls out to the arsenal. He gets kegs of powder brought up, and this is a literal firestorm in the city. Uh, if you read the accounts, they talk about the roar of the fire, the thickness of the smoke. The streets are full of burning embers. This was a fire that was encompassing 12 blocks of downtown St. Louis. So, and is just raging. People are running all around screaming, looking for loved ones, wagons going through the streets. It's chaos. And through this, you have Targhee and his men who are putting barrels of black powder on their shoulders and running through this to blow up these buildings ahead of the fire. And as you can imagine, uh, what happens is a disaster, is that they run in, they set uh, a keg down, and for whatever reason, it prematurely explodes, and Targhee is killed and literally blown to bits. The outcome, however, of the overall effort is that it worked. Bringing the buildings down stops the fire, the path of the fire, and by the early morning hours of May 18th, the fire is under control and they were able to extinguish it. but it's uh, was in its aftermath. You see the city here in this image, another easterly image of the devastation that existed after the fire. How the city looks like one of those German cities in World War II that was completely bombed out. There were uh, hundreds of businesses that were lost, and people's homes, and uh, you know, so many buildings, as well as all those steamboats that were completely destroyed. But interestingly enough, very few people actually died in the fire. The fire moved quickly, but not so quickly that people couldn't get out ahead of it. And those who were that died actually died in things like the explosions, or they found a number of people who had been trying to loot some of these buildings, and the buildings would burn and collapse around them. So it was a surprisingly low number of victims of the fire. And then finally, we talk about the cholera epidemic. And this, of course, is a very topical subject right now. Um, when I wrote this book and when it was released in February of 2018, I certainly never imagined myself living through an actual epidemic like we're living today. And in thinking back about everything I learned about 1849 and looking around today, there are so many similarities. It is very interesting of all the different similarities that I can see. The first and most obvious is the anxiety that people feel, and not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing what's going to happen with their health, not knowing what's going to happen with their livelihoods. And this is something that you definitely see in 1849 as well. The one good thing, the one major change nowadays is, of course, is at least have some idea of why this is happening. In 1849, they did not. It was some 20 years. It would be another 20 years before germ therapy was discovered. Germ theory. Did I say germ therapy or germ? I meant germ theory, not germ therapy. Germ theory was discovered, and so in 1849, people had no idea how this was being spread, and they had all kinds of very bizarre ideas. But the most uh, common idea about how it was transmitted, how it was spread, was through bad air. It was miasmatic. This is an idea that goes back to the ancient Greeks, that if you breathe in stinky air, putrid air, that it's going to throw off the balance of your body and make you sick. And so not only were they attempting to clean up putrid uh, areas of the town, which was good, but they were also doing bizarre things like at sundown each night, they would ignite barrels of tar, of pitch, to burn with the idea that it would cleanse the air. Doctors had no idea how to treat it. They were giving people all kinds of bizarre remedies, many medicines that had things like mercury in them and other poisons, and some doctors were still bleeding their patients as they had done, centuries before. And the irony, of course, is that cholera is pretty simple to treat because you die essentially from dehydration. And people would get sick, they'd lose all their bodily fluids, vomiting, diarrhea, etc., and their bodies would shut down. Interesting is that the doctors who treated their patients with things like teas and stuff that rehydrated them had the best recovery rates. but many thousands would die because of this ignorance of what was going on. Cholera is spread mainly by contaminated water. It's a fecal oral transmission of disease, um, which means that it's essentially sewage water that is the main culprit. And the largest number of victims would actually be poor immigrant mothers and children under the age of 5, which makes sense when you think about that transmission because these women were bathing their children, they were changing their diapers, they were at most risk of becoming infected and then spreading it on to their families. Um, it also did not help that places like Chateau's Pond existed in the city. Again, like I said earlier, it had become just waste dump, this sewage canal where all this industrial waste and runoff was going to. And people who lived around Chateau's Pond had the highest mortality rates. One neighborhood was called Shepherd's Graveyard because so many people died there. And immigrants were coming in, they were living in these neighborhoods. People would die, the houses would be evacuated, new immigrants would move in, they would die, and so forth and so on until the city actually had to step in and board up these houses or tear them down in order to stop the spread. If you were wealthy enough, you could leave the city. You could go out to places like Carondelet and stay at a resort, like the Montezano House, which you see up on the hill there. You can see the top of that in this painting. But most people did not have that option. They had to stay in the city and endure it. One way the city dealt with it, and again, very similarly to what we're doing now, is quarantine. They instituted a quarantine system where they stopped the riverboats that were flowing into the city. If they would have a physician come on board, they would inspect the cleanliness of the boat. If it was determined that someone was ill, they would pull them off and put them on this island, which they called Quarantine Island, was also Arsenal Island. Um, Eventually, they would build a little hospital complex on there, and people would be quarantined there for up to 10 days. The unfortunate thing is that many people would never leave the island. They also had to put a graveyard on the island because so many people died. But I really believe that this quarantine system probably saved the city from being hit even harder than it was. And it slowed the spread of cholera into the city. In the end, the official count for death tolls would be 4,547. However, uh, it was widely understood that this number was very low. It was undercounted. There were many people, it was known, hundreds, if not thousands of people who died in the city whose deaths were not recorded because their families never alerted authorities. They took them out into the country to bury them in farms and little small cemeteries and things like that. So there was never any official count for them. We also know that all those people that were flowing into the city headed west, many of them contracted here in the city and took it with them. And it's thought that as many as 20,000 people died on the western trails from cholera, many of them probably contracting it here in St. Louis. The story that best describes the situation of any individual going on living through the cholera is this man, an account written by Michael McGinnis. McGinnis was a young man in the 1840s. He became the caretaker, the sexton of the Rock Springs Cemetery, which existed where IKEA is built today. He was in charge essentially of burying the dead in 1849. And when he was an old man, he had his own column in the Kirkwood newspaper, like an old timers reminiscence column. And he talked, uh, recalls a day um, when he was working in the cemetery. And this is a very emotional an account and really gives you an idea of what people were going through. And I want to read you an excerpt from his reminiscence. McGinnis wrote, "The scenes of sorrow, grief, and distress of that year will never be effaced from the writer's mind. One of these scenes is indelibly stamped on his brain. On a very hot day, near the close of the cholera, I was standing at the graveyard gate. Coming up the road was a woman carrying a large bundle. I stepped out, seeing she was staggering under the load, and invited her to come into the shade of a tree and rest. She walked in, laid the bundle on the grass, and laid down beside it, exhausted. I ran and brought a bucket of ice water. She revived slightly, and I walked away, keeping my eye on her. After some time she rose, and I went over to tell her to stay longer, but her answer was she had to get back to town. Then she handed the writer a poor ticket for a grave for a child 12 years old. I told her that was all right and asked when the remains would be brought. She answered by pointing to the bundle. It is here. She told me her husband and one child had died with the cholera, and now this child was the last, and she felt she would soon follow. She did not have a friend or 1 cent to bury the child, so she went to the Archbishop for a free grave. I am certain he never knew how poor she was. She then went home, wrapped her darling in a quilt, and carried her in her arms to the graveyard. Her story almost bursted my heart. I told her to sit down whilst a grave was prepared, then got some boards and made a box for the remains, laid flowers and twigs under and over the body, dropped the remains into a grave, covered the top with leaves so as to prevent the sound of the earth over the remains, placed a board at the head so as to mark the grave, then walked with the poor mother to the gate. Turning around, she told me she was the last of her people, and very likely I would bury her remains the following week. She held out her hand with tears in her eyes, thanked me for the comfort I had given her, walked away, and I never heard of her since. The whole scene completely unnerved me, and I can almost see that poor mother now as she looked, staggering down the road alone, holding up her hand as if she were praying for comfort or a happy death with those she loved. I can feel the tears running down my cheeks now, 58 years after." So McGinnis's account tells us, just how uncertain, how scary life was at this time. That, this was a period when people were witnessing death all around them. Accounts from the time period talk about how the streets were deserted, um, because people were leaving the city to get out, and business essentially dried up. But the streets were soon filled not with people going around on their daily lives, but with funeral processions going out to the various cemeteries. So it was very scary. One of the things that they did was, of course, ring bells, ring the church bells when there was a funeral. They were ringing so constantly that it was becoming a point of anxiety for the city, and the city actually, you know, outlawed it so it wouldn't raise the anxiety level in the city anymore. So there are good things, however, that came out of the epidemic, certainly out of 1849. The city essentially transitions from this frontier town into a more modern city. The fire forced the city to look at its infrastructure, to pass ordinances that made buildings fireproof, like um, uh, they had to be made out of brick. They had to have cast iron structures and storefronts. The streets were widened. The cholera forced the city to look at Chateau's Pond and the bad sewage systems, and they rebuilt all these. They drained Chateau's Pond. They built new sewers. They improved the water supply to the city. And certainly the experience that these doctors received from the cholera epidemic was put forward in future health crises. They built infectious disease hospitals in the city. They used the quarantine station for future problems like yellow fever and the 1866 cholera outbreak that happened after the Civil War. And none of these became nowhere near as deadly as 1849 because they had learned so many lessons. So I hope you will buy the book. It is certainly available at the Missouri Historical Society, at the gift shop, online, places like Amazon and Barnes and Noble. It was an extreme time. It was a very fascinating time. And like I said earlier, I hope that the voices of those people who actually lived through it actually come through in the book, and I hope you enjoy it. And thank you for attending today, and thank you to the Eugene Fieldhouse for sponsoring me today and the Missouri Historical